It's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Kuntz. He is the Executive Director of Analytical Toxicology at Clinical Reference Lab. He is a board-certified toxicologist and national expert of drug testing and has testified extensively for court hearing. He is also editorial board for clinical and forensic toxicology news. We know Dr. Kuntz for many years, and he always provides us with great knowledge. Please welcome with me, Dr. Kuntz.
All right. You can see the slide? Everything's good?
Dr. Kuntz, before we get started, could you go up to the upper left-hand corner and hit display settings? We're seeing your notifications, I think.
Upper left-hand display settings. Swap.
Yep, there you go. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Missed that slide. Okay. I'm going to go quite fast. I got a half an hour. I'm going to do a little bit about opioid history. There's a lot of things that people are not aware about how we got where we are, and there's a lot of overlap with what happened in China in the 1800s and what we have going on here. So I will cover that fairly quickly. I understand the slides are going to be available for you. I'm not going to read slides. I'm going to hit them over very quickly, and then I'll get into today. I'm just going to focus on fentanyl. So we're going to lead with history into fentanyl and give you what we're doing. So in the United States has had a long history with cocaine, marijuana, heroin, and opium. That all kind of came to an end. If you go back, and it was the Harrison Narcotic Act of 1914 that was the beginning of the control of narcotics, and you all know it as a schedule system now. And that came out shortly, well, in 1909, there was a Shanghai conference on drug abuse at international. And so that kind of all came out of that. So I'm going to show you some of those slides from the 1800s to early 1920s, because obviously some of this had to change because of the Narcotic Act. So the first ones here is, from Maine. They were basically using morphine for teething babies. For me growing up, grandma always wanted to use whiskey for teething, but we moved on. But there was also products like heroin cough drops, cocaine, laced toothache medicine. Some of that's going to work pretty well. And it was just popular. You came into the throat pastils that was methanol, eucalyptus, and cocaine. I'm not sure what the cocaine tablets at all said it cures nervousness, headache, and sleeplessness. I'm not sure how that all worked. It seems like it's more of a stimulant. And then, of course, most everybody remembers that Coca-Cola started with cocaine. Now, the other device, upper left, diamorphine was for sore throats and cocaine, but diamorphine was heroin. So obviously you're going to cure something with things like that. And then there was coca wine. There was the other French tonic wine, 7 milligrams of cocaine per ounce. I'm not sure why it was there. Maybe the leaves were flavoring, because cocaine orally, excuse me, is not very effective. And then we get into marijuana. It was still popular back then. It still continues. The one that just drives me crazy is the upper left-hand corner. And the daughter's asking the mom, "We'll have lots to smoke this winter, won't we, mother?" I mean, things like that. So it was still God's gift. It was still the elixir. And then we're still kind of working through all of that. And that leads to another discussion, extensive discussion, how we get to the next stage. But I do want to speak a little bit about the brief history of the trade wars, opium trade between Great Britain and China. It seems like most people are not aware what was going on. I certainly wasn't until not that long ago, about the opium wars. and how we got to that, and United States involvement with this. Just real briefly on opium origins, it's referred to as poppy tears. It all comes from the seed capsule from the opium poppy. But this all goes back a long time. I mean, 5,000 BC, records go into 2100 BC. But it wasn't until about the 1st century, I think some Arabian surgeons started finding out they were using it for surgery prior to some surgery as a treatment. It was introduced. It wasn't a common thing in China for medicinal use. And of course, for me growing up, it was all about the Chinese opium dens and all of that, believing that it was always there, but it wasn't. And of course, there's, the tinctures of opium, paregoric, I think is still maybe available. It used to be until about 1970 as a sign-off at the pharmacy to get 2 ounces of paregoric. I remember doing that. I come from a pharmacy background, so I've been doing drugs stuff for 50 years. Now, opium was largely grown around the Mediterranean Sea countries. And Turkey was one of those, along with like India, Bangladesh, and all of that. So there was really 2 sources for opium and to trade to China. In the 1600s, the British East India Company was created. Actually, in the year 1600, it was created by Queen Elizabeth I, and she was created this, and it was a collection of merchants that were going to be trading. And their big thing was, obviously, back in those days, it was trading for tea, silk, ceramics, those types of things. But they slowly turned into a smuggling ring to get opium into China via India, largely. Well, I'll get into this in a little bit, but I'll say it now. United States got involved as well, but they sourced their opium out of Turkey. So, India, British East India Company had all of that control in the South, the Southeast countries. United States had to get it from somewhere else. So, by 1800s, it was becoming fairly common as a medical treatment, certainly to replace the heavy metals and then treat the cholera and that. So a little bit more history, and hopefully you find it somewhat interesting. The British taxation on tea, it really wasn't the British taxation, it was the East India taxing the tea into the colonies. And that's what led to the revolt. The United States, or back then, the colonies couldn't source their own tea from the Far East because the East India Company controlled it. And so, December 16, 1773, we had the Boston Tea Party. So the British East India Company had like 200,000 soldiers in their army to protect its trade. They actually had more soldiers than Great Britain did, or England did at that time. So they used their army as a way to expand the British interests. Probably the most famous places that I can think of is probably India. Thinking back and looking at the old movies, and that ended in 1858, with the independence of India from Great Britain. And eventually East India Company dissolved in 1874, but that was almost 3 centuries of that. To give you an idea of how much opium was traded, I mean, we're talking thousands of tons. This is a warehouse picture out of Patna, India. That building's about, as far as I could tell, looking at it, is about 10 stories tall. And then they had all these casks of opium, and they used the Indian first people either as workers or slaves to basically create this and store it. And that was ultimately that was transferred over to China. Now, this is beginning of the Opium Wars. The Qing Dynasty tried to ban opium in that country from 1829 to 1831. But the illegal imports kept growing, and nobody would listen to the dynasty leader, and they kept bringing it into China. And just as we had the Boston Tea Party, there was kind of a counter to that in China, and where 1,400 tons of opium was destroyed at one point, and then that led to the first opium war. So we're well on the track doing that. They kind of used their 200,000 soldiers, overwhelmed China, and everything kind of moved forward with the British in charge. The war ended officially in 1842, and that kind of leads to China needed to compensate the Britain for their financial losses. So that led to the Treaty of Nanking, which led to ceding Hong Kong Island to Great Britain. Plus, they had to give up $21 million. So it finally ended, and as we probably kind of remember, it's been a while. China got the control back of Hong Kong in 1997, and it was 155 years of treaty time before that occurred. And then, of course, we always have to have a second opium war for the legalization of for opium continuing. Now, there are some remarkable parallels to what happened in India. I shouldn't say India, in China, United States. You know, after the wars were over, China tried to legalize opium to control the drug, and they started to produce their own. But there was a dramatic decrease in the revenues from the illicit trade, and they started to tax it to fund the government. So it's kind of like a parallel for the United States. You know, we can't control it. You know, the Nancy Reagan just say no programs didn't work. We couldn't put enough military control on it for the drug trade coming largely from Mexico. So we'll tax it instead. Now, there is the U.S. part here, and it actually has, I think, a connection to the Civil War. John Astor, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's father, and others from the Northeast of the United States made millions doing, as was quoted, fair and honorable and legitimate trade. And by 1818, the United States provided a third of the opium to China, but that was sourced out of Turkey primarily, and not India and so forth. Now, we're getting closer to the United States involvement. The opium was used largely or predominantly by the Union Army. And I think that is largely, I could find statistics on opium use by the Union Army, but not the Confederate Army. And I think that's because the control of the opium trade was done out of places like Boston and Baltimore and, you know, the states up there with the coastal cities, and not so much in the South. So we began our first real opium epidemic in the United States following the Civil War. There's documentation they used 10 million opium pills, 2.8 million ounces of opium powders and tinctures. And then it was also at that time, the syringe was created, invented. And so, you know, opium addiction always occurs a little quicker when you can get it IV. Now, Boston, I mean, there was addiction that was known as opium slavery, opium or morphine mania. But by 1888, 15% of all prescriptions in Boston were opiates. Now, one of the other unknown facts, I think, I'm old enough to remember this getting the Sears and Roebuck catalog, but in 1900, you could buy heroin through Sears and Roebuck for $1.50. You got a couple of vials of heroin, a syringe, 2 needles, a heroin kit, and off you went, and you just kept going. Now, we're moving into fentanyl. Obviously, harvesting poppies is a lot of work. It takes acres and acres of land to grow the poppies, have the right environment, heavily labor intensive. The ability to make heroin, basically you just extract out the morphine, add acetic anhydride, you store it up, you reflux it, and you can get heroin. Now that was done in 1874. And of course, the Bayer company was out of Germany, just as the Bayer aspirin, which came out in 1899. And then we get into fentanyl. So now you understand why we're moving on to fentanyl. You can get the 4-AMPP, reflux it with propanyl chloride. It's very toxic, but you can, with the right ventilation, you can do it in your garage. So the 4-AMPP is the backbone for the fentanyl molecule. And that's you can buy a kilogram for $800. It could make 415,000 pills. You can make $1.2 million. So those kinds of numbers are kind of important, the 415,000 pills, because of the confiscation that we'll see in a couple minutes here. So you all are aware of fentanyl, its advantages, disadvantages, but we still have about 70,000 people dying per year. There's the last 2 bullets are the ones that I would like to bring forward, because in the around year 2000, during the early epidemic of narcotics, of oxys and hydros, we had a lot of prescriptions being written. But even now, there's still 100. The last numbers I could find in 2022, there was 131 million prescriptions for opioids, which is 39.5 prescriptions per 100 individuals. It's down from 153 million prescriptions in 2019. So we are still, heavily doing all of that. Not that it's wrong. It's just that compared to Europe, we are an opioid country. Now, this pill press, you saw the little pills, and that's what people are getting in trouble with. Now, this is just a little hand crank pill press. I've made pills. I have a pharmaceutics background for a while before I went into toxicology, and you could make these. Now, I think almost everyone has seen how potent it is, with the little powder at the end of a lead pencil. Now, trying, and that was supposed to be a fatal dose. We're looking at small amounts. And so all you have to do is really mix this with compressible sugars. You add your dye print, you put your M, and I think it was at 30, you kind of create this fake oxy. But the key there is how well can you mix? Something that potent is always going to lead to hot spots. People will underestimate the amount of potency that there is. And you can still buy these off of eBay for $400. You can buy a pill press, and you can crank that, and you can make thousands of pills per hour just as fast as you could crank. The medical fentanyls are listed there along with the illicits. We have stopped here at the laboratory looking for the illicits. One, I don't look for carfentanil because usually if you can find it, it's usually post-mortem. The floral fentanyls, basically you start with your fentanyl and then you add functional groups to that fentanyl. It's never 100% pure at the end product, so you always have plenty of fentanyl floating around. So we can look for fentanyl even though, and I can find all of the illicit fentanyl users, because fentanyl designers went to Schedule 1, there was no longer any advantage to go through the extra steps to make a designer, because the punishment or penalties would have been the same for fentanyl. Now, the fentanyl products have been used, and if anybody remembers, there's well, let's see, what was that? Theater Symphony Force Theater Moscow rescue attempt. Chechens took over the theater, had 900 people. They ultimately used carfentanil and maybe remifentanil to incapacitate terrorists. They overestimated how much gas they needed to use, and they killed 300 hostages as well. So that was the first military use of that. Now, getting into the opiate waves, I'm just going to talk briefly about this. And we all kind of understand wave one, the traditional pharmaceutical opiates, then there was heroin, and then it slowly became fentanyl. We are into wave number 4 due to the mixing of fentanyl with stimulants. This slide has the red, what you can see are the fatalities with stimulants versus no stimulants. So those numbers are dramatically increasing. They still are. The green is no fentanyl opioids, and then the purple is heroin. So there's good things on this. Heroin is down because it's more difficult to produce and bring it to the country. The tiny numbers on the left-hand side are the number of deaths per 100,000. So it goes from 0 to 11. So you could see a little bit there about the rates. So fentanyl with stimulants, and we'll see that in just a couple minutes. You know, opioids, I kind of like the slide because, you know, the summer you had the ice cream trucks, and now you have Amazon deliveries. You can get whatever you want delivered to your door. You know, so it is everywhere. You don't have to go to the wrong side of the city to get your drugs. You just have them delivered to you in the suburbs. Now, there is a couple different ways to look at confiscations or apprehensions, because there's the DEA version, which are the DEA seizures, and then you have the National Guards from the different states. So in 2023, the DEA confiscated 79 million fake pills. Well, as the one slide before, 1 kilogram of 4-AMPP makes 400,000 pills. So we are much of this is still going by. It wasn't until 2014 that there was actually things found at the border crossing. You know, it was 23 pounds. The latest I can find, the average seizure weight is 2.6 pounds of fentanyl. 20% are from pedestrians, probably crossing the border, and 7% are heroin. So, we are making some progress in finding that, and certainly heroin is not the problem anymore. And here's another graphic. You can see the seizures going up. California National Guard in March said they found 62,000 pounds of fentanyl, 1,000% increase over 2021. So there you go. It's out there. It's everywhere. It doesn't seem like it's slowing down significantly. The number of deaths just due to fentanyl, I have the arrow drawn there. And if you look way over to the right, you get to the number of deaths, and it kind of falls between diabetes and kidney disease. So some of those numbers kind of fall into unintentional injuries, which are a few lines up. But when we talk about just fentanyl alone as fatalities, we're there. So we have a lot of deaths going on. Now, I participated in with the federal government HHS and tried to select fentanyl cutoffs. So I'm going to give you a little bit of information on the urine fentanyls. On that very busy baseline, I had 4,500 fentanyl positives in urine. The median value was 12.6. My highest level I had in urine was 36,000 nanograms. So huge amounts. So obviously that largely isn't a casual user, but the fentanyl levels are 4 times lower than norfentanyl in urine. Randoms, we have 57% of our samples are due to fentanyl in randoms. I think because they aren't aware of like pre-employment. Pre-employment, only 5%. So again, it's like much of the other things. People are studying up a little bit for their drug test as a pre-employment, stop using their drugs. It's the randoms that are catching them. So we do see fentanyls all day long, and they're employed in the workplace. This data that I'm providing you is workplace data. I've extracted out all the probation, parole, and all of that to simplify it. So we have, it's done with other drugs. I'll give you a quick look there. The predominant drug it's found with is marijuana, which is not surprising. Almost 20% have methamphetamine, hence the stimulants plus fentanyl. I do have unusual drug, I think it's methadone. We see a lot of methadone positives and fentanyl positives together, and I'm not quite sure why, but it is that way also in oral fluids. So morphine, way at the bottom, it's 5%. We don't see that much opiates and fentanyl together. So by reasons for test, the polydrug samples, random's got 65%. If you have fentanyl, you have other drugs, so it is mixed with a lot of other drugs, whether it is a secondary drug or whether they bought a product that contained both, such as people are buying Xanax and it may have Xanax plus fentanyl because the people are dying from fentanyl and not from benzodiazepines. The other factor here is 90% of all my fentanyl positives, whether it's urine or oral fluids, do not have opiates other than fentanyl. Of course, we have a few the outliers that'll have oxys and hydros and combinations, and I think that's largely due because they're taking anything that they could find. Fentanyl levels in oral fluids are 5 times higher than norfentanyl, and the median value for oral fluids is 19. Again, we could see the gray areas, my positives, and I can drag my whatever number I want to use. If I want to pick 4, I draw this line across and down, which means I'm going to lose about 41 of those 200 positives. So this was an easy way for the federal government to make up some of their decisions and coming up with realistic values instead of speculative how we got there. Again, random, 43% of those positive fentanyls come out of randoms. Pre-employment still at 4%. We look at polydrug positives. Marijuana is lower, which you kind of expect because of detection windows. Methamphetamine, again, pushing the 20% range. And then methadone and cocaine. All of those, again, methadone, I can't quite figure out where that's all coming from. And just as we're finishing up here, there's 2 graphs. Blue bars are my fentanyl positives in urine, and we're running a little bit about 1.25%. We have seen orange is oral fluids. We were over 2%. So it is easy to find in oral fluids if you are looking at that. So just to finish up, quick summary. the Mexican cartels, I guess, basically weren't the first cartels trafficking in illicit drugs. I mean, we have the Brits, we have the Americans moving opium across the oceans. Adding fentanyl to the stimulants seems to be the real thing. Fentanyl's not hard to find, contrary to what a lot of people think. And finally, the fentanyl inclusion by HHS and DOT, that does create a problem for those of us that are involved in drug testing with the federal program, because unless there is FDA cleared reagents for both, the urine can, I should say both urine and oral fluids. There is none for oral fluids right now. So HHS can't add fentanyl unless there is reagents and a DOT program for oral fluids. And as most of you or some of you are aware, although it's been approved for years, it hasn't occurred yet because there isn't reagents. So just finishing up, thank you for your time. I went really fast to try and get done in my half hour. And if I'm sure I can be reached out to, I'll answer any questions that you have at a later time if there's not any time currently. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present this.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kuntz.